Hello and welcome to the presentation CMS's proposed metrics for recertification of organ procurement organizations. My name is John Snyder and I serve as Director of the Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients at Hennepin Healthcare Research Institute in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I do have a few disclosures relevant to my presentation. My employer, HHRI, has contracts with the Living Legacy Foundation and Donate Life America. I do not intend to reference unlabeled or unapproved uses of drugs in my presentation, and I have non-compensated board memberships on Donate Life America, the LifeSource Clinical Policy Board, and the Organ Donation and Transplantation Alliance. This work was supported wholly or in part by HRSA, and the content is the responsibility of the authors alone and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of the Department of Health and Human Services, nor does mention of trade names, commercial products, or organizations imply endorsement by the U.S. government. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors in this work. As background, President Trump issued the executive order on advancing American kidney health on July 10, 2019, and the order included a directive to increase the procurement and utilization of available organs by revising organ procurement organization rules and evaluation metrics in order to, quote, establish more transparent, reliable, and enforceable objective metrics for evaluating an OPO's performance. Following the executive order in December of 2019, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, released a notice of proposed rulemaking that included two proposed metrics and performance standards, and their metrics were labeled the donation rate and the transplantation rate. The SRTR evaluated the proposed metrics and performance standards using the most recent available data from the years 2016 and 2017. CMS's proposed donation and transplantation metrics both use the same denominator to define organ donor potential, and that is somebody who's age 75 or younger, and we interpreted that to mean less than their 76th birthday. The patient died in a hospital setting, an inpatient setting in a hospital, and had no exclusionary diagnostics codes. The codes are listed in the proposed rule, but I will not be evaluating the full list of codes in this presentation. The numerator for the donation rate metric would be any of those donors or potential donors in the denominator that had at least one organ transplanted. And the transplantation rate numerator would be the number of organs that were transplanted. So both of those would be divided by the same denominator. A few nuances that I'd like to note about the denominator. The proposed data source is the CDC mortality multiple cause data available through the National Center for Health Statistics. The place of death should be used for this versus the place of residence. And I just point out that the CDC Wonder database, which is publicly available online, only includes the place of residence. And so to determine the actual place of death, one needs to obtain the underlying data through a data use agreement with the NCHS. And the NCHS data, also available through a DOA, has all deaths in it versus the CDC Wonder only contains deaths for U.S. citizens. So those are nuances that I like to point out if people are trying to replicate the analysis. A few nuances of the numerators. So the numerators would use the OPTN data available from UNOS. The definition of a donor in this case would be one or more organs transplanted, which is the CMS proposal. And I like to point out the difference between that and the traditional definition of a donor in the OPTN definitions, which is that one or more organs were recovered for the purpose of transplant, but the donor did not necessarily have to have any organs transplanted. In the CMS definition, pancreata sent for research or islets would be counted. And I think it's an open question of whether the date of death of the potential donor or the date of recovery would be used. Typical UNOS SRTR analyses would use the date of recovery to define the donor rather than the date of death. But I think it's in this case where we're lining up donors with deaths that occurred within a donation service area, we would probably want to be using the date of death. The analysis I'm presenting to you today does use the date of recovery rather than the date of death. And so using this filtering criteria with the CDC data, in the calendar year 2017, this is the year I will be evaluating, there were 2.85 million total deaths. Of those, 1.36 million approximately were under the age of 76, and 460,634 of those were inpatient. So this establishes the top order filtering of that denominator. So we're down to 16% of total deaths at that time. In the CMS rule on the table to the right, I compared then, starting with those inpatient deaths, we would remove deaths with any exclusionary ICD-10 codes. That brings the denominator for the CMS definition down to 271,260. And I've simply compared that definition with what the denominators we would achieve using the deceased donor potential study and the metric proposed by Dr. Goldberg and colleagues in the American Journal of Transplantation in 2019. And so you can see the CMS denominator is 9.5% of total deaths in that calendar year. The deceased donor potential study would limit that even further to 1.8% of total deaths. And Dr. Goldberg's proposal in 2019 would be in the middle at 5.1% of deaths. So how does this work? So this is the evaluation of the donation rate using the 2017 data and CMS's proposed definition. Each of the blue dots is an OPO that would be evaluated. The x-axis is just stratified by the number of potential donors per the CMS definition, and the y-axis would be the donation rate per the CMS definition. And so there's flagging rules associated with the metrics. How would CMS choose which OPOs to potentially decertify if they do not meet their standards? And the rule simply has 4 steps. We first calculate the metric for the prior calendar year, and we calculate the 75th percentile of the distribution of the OPOs using that metric, and that would become the new flag boundary for the current year's evaluation. We would calculate the metric and the upper one-sided 95% confidence interval for the current year, and then we would flag if an upper bound of the one-sided 95% confidence interval is less than the flag boundary. And to illustrate how that works, I've backed up a year now, and this is the 2016 data, and so again, just calculating the same metrics for the 58 OPOs. And we would identify the 75th percentile of those metrics, and that would be this red dashed line here at a donation rate of 4.11 donors per 100 potential donors. That becomes the new standard for 2017, so we would overlay on that boundary the 2017 evaluation, and when I overlay those points, any dot that would be below this flag boundary would have an upper 95% confidence bound that does not cross 4.11. And so any dots below that boundary would then become flagged per the CMS rule. In this example in 2017, 53% of the OPOs would fail the standard. And that's what this looks like if we map out the 58 organ procurement organizations. Those in red would fail the standard in 2017. Similarly, if we plot the transplant rate, very similar idea here. The new standard from 2016 is 13.73 organs transplanted per potential donor. 36 of the 58 OPOs would fail that standard in 2017. And these are the OPOs. Look similar. There are some differences in terms of which fail the standard compared with the donation rate. And the CMS rule indicates that any OPO would have to pass both standards. And so if we compare which OPOs fail either standard, either the donation rate or the transplant rate, those are shown here. So the blue OPOs would be the only ones passing both standards. The red fail both. The purple pass the donation rate metric but fail the transplant rate metric. And the green fail the donation rate metric but pass the transplant rate metric. So when we look at it in whole, 64% of the OPOs, or 37 of the 58, would fail the standard. The CMS proposal does not indicate that they would pursue any risk adjustment for differences in the underlying donor, potential donor population across the different OPOs. And so we simply ask the question, does it matter? Again, what I'm showing you here is what you've seen before, which is the donor rate per 100 donors. And so what we did is we calculated a simple model with adjustment for age, race, Hispanic ethnicity, and just asked the question, does it actually matter? And you can see the graph looks a little bit different because now the y-axis is an observed to expected, where we're calculating the observed number of donors and then we're comparing that to the expected number per the risk adjustment. And you can see the triangles on this plot are those that would change their pass-fail status. And so certainly there are some that are near that flag boundary to begin with and that could bounce either side of the boundary. But you can see a number of OPOs there in purple triangles or green triangles that do change their status. Under the adjusted metric here for the donation rate, 35 of the 58 fail, which is 60%. And when we look at the adjusted transplant rate, again, there's a few OPOs there with the green triangles or the purple triangles that would change their status given the risk adjustment. And here, 63.8% of the OPOs, 37 of the 58 fail the transplant rate metric. We did also encounter some differences between our calculated denominator from the CDC data versus what was published in the CMS Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. And I highlight simply a few OPOs on the upper right here, the top 5 OPOs that appeared to have substantial differences between what the SRTR calculated the denominator to be and what was published by CMS. We think that the differences here are caused by how the counties within a donation service area are assigned to an OPO, particularly with how counties that are shared between two OPOs are tabulated. Some hospitals within a donor service area would have a waiver to work with a neighboring OPO, and it's currently unclear how those donors would be counted, given that the CDC data do not allow us to establish which specific hospital a potential donor was located at, simply which county the death was in. So that's an open question. We also had a few differences in the ICD-10 exclusion list that were published by CMS, so there may be some differences there as well. But these top 5 OPOs, we believe that the major differences are just how we assign deaths within counties to the OPOs, but that is a remaining question we'd like to investigate. So in conclusion, under the CMS proposed metrics and rules, if applied to 2017, 37 of the 58 OPOs, or 64%, would fail either the donation rate or the transplantation rate metric and risk decertification. Risk adjustment would alter the set of OPOs failing the metrics, and we have some remaining uncertainty about the exact mapping of counties to OPOs and how donor hospitals with waivers to work with neighboring OPOs would be counted. Just point the reader to the publication, the recent publication in the American Journal of Transplantation that has much more detail than what I was able to provide to you in this presentation. And I appreciate your attention. Thank you.